China. Elite politics. Fighting on two fronts. Beyond his grapples with Donald Trump, Xi Jinping has plenty of other problems.
In Beijing, springtime warmth has drawn queues to restaurants offering alfresco dining. Trendy shopping districts are crowded. Mr. Jia, a 36-year-old investor, says he is not bothered by America's tariffs. Standing outside his friend's cupcake shop, he says Donald Trump's levies are a sign that America feels threatened by China's rise. America's power is declining, he says. What you feel in today's world is that hegemony is very hard to achieve. The trade war is everywhere. State media trumpet President Xi Jinping's support for multilateralism and international trade rules. Newspapers have shown Mr. Xi on a visit to Southeast Asia, creating development opportunities and supporting regional economic integration in the face of MAGA protectionism. China has warned countries it will retaliate if they buckle to American pressure to impose tariffs on China. There is some evidence the charm and harm campaign is working. On April 22nd, it was reported that Mr. Xi will be presented this week with a letter from Ishiba Shigeru, Japan's Prime Minister, aimed at maintaining stable trade links. Yet for Mr. Xi, what matters more is the domestic picture. Relations with America and the world are not top of the list for the things that might keep him awake at night, says a former senior American intelligence official. Part of that calculus relates to the economic consequences within China of the trade war. The other is less noticed but critical. Just as the economy is battling serious headwinds, Mr. Xi's campaign to drive out corruption and enforce loyalty in the top ranks of the Communist Party is generating turbulence. Officials have seized on data that appear to show China's ability to withstand tariffs. On April 16th, they declared first-quarter growth of 5.4% year-on-year, better than predicted. The full-year target is about 5%. The figure was buoyed by stimulus and a front-running of exports ahead of tariffs. The volume of shipping containers processed rose by 10% year-on-year in the week to April 20th, says Bloomberg, a news and analysis firm. Still, economists expect a sharp slowdown. Freight activity indicators suggest a drop is coming, says a survey by Goldman Sachs, a bank. Before Liberation Day, UBS, another bank, predicted growth of 4% in 2025. It now says 3.4% if the levies remain. Party leaders are paranoid about social stability, and Mr. Xi will be watching how an export and industrial slowdown might filter through into fragile public confidence. There are signs of nervousness. A survey by Morgan Stanley, another bank, after tariffs soared this month, found that 44% of 2,000 respondents in cities across China were worried that they or family members might lose their jobs, with many citing the levies. This was the highest share since the bank began conducting such polls in 2020. In terms of the relative negotiating hand China has with America, a weakening of domestic confidence has to be weighed against the carnage in the United States. On April 22nd, reports emerged that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, had reassured investors in a private meeting that a trade deal with China would eventually be struck. Also that day, Mr. Trump said his tariffs on Chinese imports would come down substantially if a deal is reached. But for now, Mr. Xi is likely to stimulate more in order to prop up consumers. We have the ability to address external challenges, according to a statistics official. A Politburo meeting in late April may be the moment for more measures to boost housing, consumption, and industry. At that Politburo meeting, Mr. Xi's other domestic obsession may be visible, a never-ending purge of the armed forces. One of the Politburo's members has not been seen in public since early March. He is General He Weidong, one of two vice-chairmen of the Central Military Commission, or CMC, and number 3 in the military hierarchy. He was absent from a tree-planting activity in Beijing in early April, attended by Mr. Xi and other CMC members. State television did not show him at a conference on diplomacy on April 8th and 9th. If General He has been purged, he would be the highest-ranking uniformed member of the CMC to be dismissed since 1967. That would show Mr. Xi's military purges are not over. Li Shangfu, then the defense minister, was targeted in 2023. Miao Hua, the admiral responsible for enforcing loyalty to Mr. Xi within the PLA, was placed under investigation in 2024. In March, a senior member of the Military Commission's anti-graft unit, Lieutenant General Tang Yong, lost his job as an advisor to the national legislature. Such shake-ups are not a sideshow. The PLA is a core component of the Communist Party itself, and purges may have weakened its combat effectiveness, according to American intelligence. The interplay between the economic consequences of the trade war and signs of turmoil at the top of the party are crucial to understanding China. In one scenario, the trade war forces it to liberalize its economy, boosting consumption rather than state-led investment and easing up on entrepreneurs. But in a more paranoid environment, it could make a more nationalistic pivot to rally the public. This is visible already. On April 15th, China's spy chief, Chen Yixin, warned that China must resolutely win the comprehensive war against hegemony. Grey zone activities intimidating Taiwan are operating at an intense pace. What probably matters most to Mr. Xi is his own position and legacy. That will be decided in 2027 at the next party congress, when many analysts expect him to seek a fourth term as party boss. The next couple of years may be his biggest test yet.
The World This Week. Business.
The IMF significantly revised down its forecasts of global growth, mostly because the swift escalation of trade tensions and extremely high levels of policy uncertainty are expected to impact economic activity. The fund now expects the world economy to expand by 2.8% this year, down from its previous projection of 3.3%. Prospects for almost all the major economies were downgraded. America's GDP is now forecast to rise by 1.8% this year, and output in the euro area is expected to increase by 0.8%, with Germany not growing at all. The IMF admitted that given the fluid policy situation, its estimates could change. Stock markets had another rollercoaster week. Investors took fright when Donald Trump made several comments deriding Jerome Powell for not cutting interest rates at a faster pace. Rumours swirled that the president was studying ways to fire the Federal Reserve's chairman, but after markets swooned at the idea of the White House interfering with the central bank, Mr. Trump toned down the rhetoric and said he had no intention of sacking Mr. Powell. The dollar dropped to a 3-year low against a basket of currencies amid Mr. Trump's tirade. The price of gold, a haven for investors in times of stress, rose by $3,500 a troy ounce for the first time. Mr. Trump soothed markets further by saying he plans to be very nice to China in trade talks, suggesting that he could substantially reduce tariffs of 145% he has imposed on most Chinese goods. Scott Bessent, Mr. Trump's Treasury Secretary, has said the trade standoff with China is unsustainable, but also that tariff reductions would not be unilateral. Meanwhile, America imposed duties of up to 3,521% on imports of solar panels from Cambodia and lower levies on those from Malaysia, Thailand and Vietnam. The tariffs come after an investigation which started during the Biden administration concluded that solar manufacturers in those countries are benefiting from state subsidies. In one telling indication of how Mr. Trump's policies have upended established trade, DHL, a global logistics company, suspended business to consumer shipments to the United States worth over $800. The company blamed more stringent customs checks in America. Business-to-business deliveries are not affected. Tesla reported a 9% drop in revenues and a 71% fall in net profit for the first quarter year-on-year. Sales of Tesla's electric cars, already under pressure from increased competition from China, have taken a hit from Elon Musk's association with the Trump administration. Deliveries fell by 13% in the quarter, but by much more in Europe, though in Britain, Tesla's biggest European market, sales were up by 3.5%. After the earnings report, Mr. Musk promised to spend more time at Tesla and reduce his work for the government, rooting out alleged inefficiencies. The race to develop faster charging times for electric car batteries continued apace when CATL, based in China, and the world's biggest battery producer, announced that its latest product could charge a car in 5 minutes with a range of 520 kilometres, that's 320 miles. BYD, Tesla's biggest rival in China, recently said it could provide a range of 470 kilometres from a 5-minute charge. The European Union fined Apple €500 million, that's $570 million, and Meta €200 million in the first penalties to be imposed for stifling competition under the EU's Digital Markets Act. Apple was fined for hindering communications between app developers and customers over pricing. Meta for telling users they must either allow their private data to be used for advertising or pay subscription fees. Both companies criticised the EU for levying the fines. Despite shutting down for a day in March because of a power outage, Heathrow Airport reported a decent increase in revenue and profit for the first quarter. United Health Group's share price failed to recover from the hammering it took after the company lowered its profit forecast. The health insurer blamed an unexpected rise in demand for medical services from older customers. Its stock slumped by 22% in a day. Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare, was murdered in December in Manhattan. The United Arab Emirates is set to take a gigantic leap of faith and use artificial intelligence to help write legislation, according to reports. The UAE has invested heavily in AI, with Abu Dhabi creating a state fund for the technology. Still, observers think allowing AI to take control of a country's laws is a brave step, given its tendency to hallucinate or make things up.
Leaders.
America's presidency. Only 1,361 days to go. Donald Trump's second term is a revolutionary project. Will it succeed?
The hyperactive first 100 days of Donald Trump's second term have been the most consequential of any president this century, and perhaps since the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Before the inauguration, Americans wondered what sort of government they were getting. That debate is now over. Mr. Trump is leading a revolutionary project that aspires to remake the economy, the bureaucracy, culture and foreign policy, even the idea of America itself. The question for the next 1,361 days is, will he succeed? Mr. Trump's presidency has been popular with his voters. His approval among Republicans is at 90%. He has faced little resistance as he has charged ahead on all fronts, attacking the civil service, law firms, universities, the media, and any institution he associates with the democratic-leaning elite. As with any revolution, MAGA has a method and a theory. The method is to bend or break the law in a blitz of executive orders, and when the courts catch up, to dare them to defy the president. The theory is one of unconstrained executive power, the idea that, as Richard Nixon suggested, if the president does something, then it's legal. This has already undermined things that actually make America great. A view of the national interest large enough to take in paying for AIDS medication in Africa. A sense that independent institutions have their own value. A belief that your political opponents can be patriots, and faith in the dollar. If this revolution is unchecked, it could lead towards authoritarianism. Some MAGA intellectuals admire Hungary, where Viktor Orbán exercises control over the courts, the universities, and the media. And America does indeed leave some room for a would-be authoritarian. Congress has created a lot of exceptions to normal rules, which can be activated by the president declaring an emergency. And Mr. Trump is making full use of them. Witness his delight at the president of El Salvador's ability to lock people up without trial. Although MAGA cannot control the media, it can intimidate their corporate owners. And besides, fragmentation has diluted the press's power to check the president. Congress is supine because Republicans owe him their jobs, and they know it. One worry is that the courts will stand their ground, only for the administration to defy their rulings. Another is that, fearing this, the Supreme Court may try to preserve its authority by preemptively caving in. Yet there is another more likely scenario in which the extremism of the first 100 days stirs up powerful forces of resistance. One such force is investors in the bond market and the stock market. Though they were broadly enthusiastic about Mr. Trump's election, they have been his most effective opponents, not out of political conviction, but because they deal in reality. They are rightly alarmed about the economy being poisoned by tariffs. Uncontrolled budget deficits and incompetent policy could lead to a crash of the dollar. Faced with distress in the markets, Mr. Trump has backed down twice in the past month, first over imposing reciprocal tariffs, and this week over firing Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve. And as Elon Musk promises to spend less time bulldozing the bureaucracy in order to tend to his ailing electric car business instead, Mr. Trump has hinted that he wants to find a way out of the unsustainable and ill-thought-through trade war he has launched against China. Another source of resistance could be voters, including Republicans, if the economy goes badly. Although Mr. Trump has succeeded in suppressing illegal immigration, his national approval rating has already fallen further and faster than any other president's, beating his own first-term record for annoying Americans. Our modelling suggests his approval rating is now below 50% in every swing state he won in November. Most Americans do not want a revolution. Many like the sound of bringing manufacturing back home, but only a quarter say they would work in those new factories. They like the idea of fair trade, but they do not want chaos. None is keen on inflation. Mr. Trump, like other presidents, may see a narrow election win as an invitation to pose for Mount Rushmore, but it does not give him the right to rule by diktat, shut agencies created by Congress, suspend habeas corpus, or grab Greenland. Eventually, bad polls will impinge on elected officials. America is a federal system that is too big and has too many rival centres of power to become Hungary, whose population is about the same as New Jersey's. Congress, too, could become a problem for Mr. Trump. Republicans have a thin majority in the House and were able to pass a budget framework only because a couple of Democratic representatives had died. Betting markets give Democrats more than an 80% chance of winning back the House next year. Control would enable the Democrats to frustrate Mr. Trump, even if he continued to govern by executive order. In the Senate, Republicans are 7 votes short of the 60 needed to avoid a filibuster. Those constraints are real. The last source of resistance is the courts. The law moves slowly, but the Supreme Court has already handed down a 9-0 ruling in the case of a man wrongly deported to El Salvador. As with other institutions, the courts have less to fear from the defiance of an unpopular president. The administration may yet lose cases on tariffs, on the president's ability to fire officials and close agencies without congressional backing, and on Mr. Trump's scattergun use of break-glass emergency provisos, such as the Alien Enemies Act. If that happens, his theory of executive power will be discredited. Even on the most optimistic reading of the MAGA revolution, Mr. Trump has already done lasting harm to America's institutions, alliances, and moral standing. And if he is thwarted by investors, voters, or the courts, he is liable to lash out against institutions with even greater ferocity. Using the newly politicized Department of Justice, he may persecute his opponents and stir up the fear and conflict that give him license to operate. Abroad, he could cause alliance-wrecking provocations in, say, Greenland or Panama. There is no going back to the way America was 100 days ago. Only 1,361 days left.
Leaders.
The Federal Reserve. Recession and succession. Jerome Powell wins a reprieve, but expect more showdowns between the White House and the Fed.
When Donald Trump is making economic policy, a reprieve is little more than a pause for breath. In February, investors cheered when he postponed tariffs on Canada and Mexico. By April, he was torching the global trading system. So it is with his latest about-face. On April 22nd, the president said he had no plans to sack Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, having spent the week threatening to do just that. Is central bank independence back? Only until the president's mood swings again, or a different advisor has his ear. Mr. Trump's ultimate desire is not in doubt. The Fed has cut rates by only a percentage point since September to 4.25 to 4.5%. Mr. Trump has always disliked tight money and covets the lower rates in Europe and elsewhere. And, by contrast with his first term, when the economy was mostly strong, he now faces the threat of a recession caused by his own foolish trade policy. As a result, Mr. Trump is now searching for a scapegoat. Mr. Powell, whom he calls a major loser, is candidate number one. The Fed thus remains vulnerable, at precisely the time when it must tackle an acute policy dilemma. Lower rates would indeed help America's economy in one key respect. Consumer and business confidence are falling, and financial markets already expect rate cuts worth at least 0.75 of a percentage point this year. A recession would typically call for more. The Fed usually lowers rates by 4 or 5 percentage points. Today's situation is far from typical, however. Tariffs are pushing up prices. Some forecasters say inflation could reach an annual rate of 4% by the end of the year. And investors are losing confidence in America. The dollar is down by 9% against a basket of major currencies since its peak in February. The S&P 500 index is down by 13%, and bond yields have been volatile. This dynamic, more typical of an emerging market, complicates Mr. Powell's task. A central bank with a stock of credibility can afford to ignore temporary inflation caused by one-off events such as tariffs. Its promise of low long-term inflation would anchor wages and prices. But the Fed's reputation has been dented by its slow response to inflation during the COVID-19 pandemic and is now threatened further by Mr. Trump's interference. Investors are pricing in inflation risk. A variety of surveys show households' expectations for inflation rising over the long term as well as the next year. The Fed, in other words, may no longer have much credibility to fall back on. Yet if it puts containing inflation expectations above fighting a recession, Mr. Trump's displeasure will grow. If the dollar sell-off turns into a crisis, the situation could become excruciating. The Fed might have to choose how much money to lend to stressed financial institutions and even to foreign central banks, while trying to adhere to its mandate and keep its distance from Mr. Trump. If Mr. Trump does not sack Mr. Powell first, a new chair will be appointed in May 2026. But Mr. Trump cannot easily dominate the Fed. The Senate must confirm his choice, which explains why the current front-runner, Kevin Warsh, is a mainstream candidate known as an inflation hawk. Monetary policy is set by a 12-member committee. Even if the Supreme Court concurs with Mr. Trump in a separate case that he can fire agency chiefs for policy choices, it has hinted at a carve-out to preserve the Fed's autonomy. And Mr. Powell could choose to stay on the Fed's board under a new chair until 2028. Yet constraints on Mr. Trump are also potential flashpoints. A committee might restrain an errant chair, just as the markets seem to hold back Mr. Trump. But using market scares to guide policy, rather than sound leadership and good judgment, is a recipe for making America vulnerable to confusion and instability. This week's relief could be quickly forgotten.
Leaders.
Demography and destiny. The Great African Migration. It is a world-changing megatrend that transcends today's populist surge.
Africa is on the move. At least 20 million emigrants live outside the continent, a threefold increase since 1990. That is higher than the number of Indian migrants outside India or Chinese migrants outside China, two big diasporas from countries with populations of similar size to the African continent. Europe accounts for about half of African migrants outside Africa, but its share has steadily declined since 1990. America, China, Saudi Arabia and Turkey have all seen surges in their African-born populations. It may seem otherworldly to predict that this will continue, given the fierce backlash against immigration across the West. But, as we explain, African migration is an unstoppable force that will long outlast today's populists and help define the 21st century. Ignore it at your peril and at your loss. Demography is one cause. It is well known that in the developed world the number of people of working age, roughly defined as those between 15 and 64, will decline, exacerbating labour shortages. What is less widely appreciated is that emerging countries that are associated with exporting people, such as Mexico and the Philippines, are also getting older and richer, meaning that smaller shares of their populations will leave in future. In Africa, by contrast, the working-age population is forecast to increase by around 700 million people by 2050. Another cause is economics. Many African countries are entering a phase in their development in which people are still poor enough to want to leave, but, for the first time, have enough money to travel long distances. And African countries create only around a fifth of the number of formal jobs required to absorb their expanding workforces. This raises two big and controversial questions, one about the consequences for Africa, and the other about the attitude of the rest of the world. It is obvious that emigration is often in the interests of those who leave. Their lives can be transformed by earning several times more in richer countries than they would at home. Leaving is often the surest route out of poverty. But African economists have a perennial concern about a brain drain. Some scholars also worry about the political effects of migration. If the best and the brightest leave, does that mean the worst are left in charge? At some point, the exodus of skilled workers is large and fast enough to do harm, especially in small countries with a shallow educated class. And in autocratic countries like Zimbabwe, such regimes endure in part because the middle class they immiserate chooses to leave rather than protest. In general, though, the problems with emigration are soluble. African graduates are underemployed at home. The remittances they and others send back are worth more than foreign direct investment and overseas aid. One study suggests that a typical African-trained doctor sends back almost twice as much in remittances as the cost of their initial training. And emigration can also lead to a brain gain. The prospect of higher wages abroad prompts more people to acquire marketable skills. Some stay at home, others leave and some eventually return with their skills enhanced. Diasporas can also undermine autocratic regimes by spreading democratic values absorbed abroad, by sending cash home that weakens citizens' dependence on crony states, and by funding the opposition. African governments should embrace the idea of emigration as an export and seek to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs. A deal struck last year between Kenya and Germany could be a model. Kenya agreed to speed up the removal of illegal migrants in Germany and to help recruit workers at home. Germany pledged support for language skills and vocational training. Africa can also learn from India, which encourages professionals trained abroad to return home, and the Philippines, which has used the emigration of nurses to reap remittances and expand the number of nurses it trains. The second controversial question is whether the rest of the world will welcome more Africans. President Donald Trump was including the continent when he spoke of shithole countries in his first term. Stephen Miller, his advisor, has said that if you import the third world, you become the third world. For its part, the European Union's Africa policy is dominated by efforts to reduce illegal immigration. Yet in the long run, the demographic pressures and economic incentives will prove too strong. Migration from Africa will continue apace, even if it falls elsewhere, because the rich world will need workers, even if the current hostility towards migrants does not fade. In any case, attitudes to legal migration are influenced by the jobs migrants do. African doctors in Britain's health service are popular. In America, Africans could become the new model minority, according to a forthcoming book. They are better educated and more likely to work than people born locally, and they support American values such as freedom and opportunity. Today's politicians mostly want to block migration. As demographic reality bites, tomorrow's will be forced to turn to the task of how to manage it better and make the most of it.
Leaders.
Artificial intelligence. Expecting the unexpected. AI models can act in surprising ways. Humans need to be smarter.
Artificial intelligence models are getting better and better. Cutting-edge systems can handle increasingly complex tasks once thought beyond the ken of machines. However, as we report in the Science and Technology section this week, they can also find surprising ways to get things done. Give an AI system the task of beating a chess-playing program, for instance, and rather than trying to checkmate its opponent, it may simply hack the program to ensure victory. Give it the job of maximizing profits for an investment client with ethical qualms, and instead of changing its strategy, it may misrepresent the harms associated with the profits. Obviously, these models have no consciousness of their own. They are not acting with deliberate malice. Instead, they are responding to a tension between their initial training and configuration, and the instructions they are subsequently given. Even so, unexpected outcomes matter. If AI is to be deployed widely, people must trust it, and there is little evidence to suggest that AI models are less likely to display worrying behaviour as they become bigger and more powerful. Indeed, the opposite seems to be the case. What to do? Being more careful about the prompts given to models might help. As with the enchanted brooms of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, commands to pursue a goal as much as possible are wont to be taken literally. If you want an AI to be careful about its methods, then it is best not to suggest that it should break boundaries. But that might not go far enough, because some seemingly deceptive behaviour may have its origins in the way a model was trained. If you tell an advanced model that it will be reprogrammed if it overperforms on a test, it may deliberately fail in order to protect itself. Fortunately, recently developed interpretability techniques can help. These allow researchers to peer inside the black box of an AI's neural network and spot unexpected behaviour as it happens. When a model is working as it should, researchers can identify the mathematical features that activate as it responds to a query and determine what each contributes to the answer. If that same model finds itself out of its depth, for example, when confronted by a tricky maths problem, it may decide to bullshit, confidently spouting random numbers in its response. Researchers monitoring the model will then see the random number feature activated, alerting them to the hallucination. Similarly, it is possible to spot a deceitful answer by following an AI's reasoning process and working out where it differs from the chain of thought it publicly expresses. These techniques are powerful, but should be used with care. Checking an AI for safety, the process known as alignment, is an arduous and thankless task. Some scoff at the very idea of harmful AI. Boosters resent the guardrails, and the temptation to cut corners is ever present. It might thus be appealing to use interpretability techniques in the training process itself to create an AI model incapable of deceiving. But doing so could backfire. It would be impossible to tell whether the model had been cured of trickery or had simply learned to do it without being discovered. Already researchers fear that cutting-edge models, despite being trained on text in human languages, are learning to think in more idiosyncratic and less comprehensible ways. Happily, there is little downside to using interpretability techniques correctly. In contrast with many other areas of AI innovation, where safety concerns have been swept aside in the interest of capability or capacity, such trade-offs do not exist here. Interpretability techniques are worth preserving for the same reason that AI deception is worth tackling, to ensure that the general-purpose technology of the next century can be relied on to achieve its potential.
United States.
Now what? Donald Trump's first 100 days have been tumultuous. Here are 5 key areas where his ambitions will clash with the courts. Separation of powers. 100 days of attitude. Congress is inert. Will courts step in?
It was April 28, 2017, the 99th day of his first administration, and President Donald Trump was frustrated. "It's a very rough system. It's an archaic system," he vented to an interviewer about working with Congress to pass legislation. Avoiding this nuisance, he mused, would be for the good of the nation. Now that he is president for the second time, Mr. Trump has decided to dispense with the archaic system. These first 100 days have been different from those of any modern president, who is usually desperate to secure some signature legislative achievement. Mr. Trump has shown little interest in Congress, despite Republican control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. He is wielding the imperial powers of the presidency to do what he likes, impose some of the highest tariff increases ever seen, shred the federal bureaucracy, and cudgel his adversaries. Yet despite a dearth of notable legislative accomplishments, Mr. Trump's first 100 days have hardly been a failure. They are arguably the most consequential of any modern president. For Mr. Trump, the executive branch is an extension of his own person. In an executive order on February 18th, he declared that the President and the Attorney General, subject to the President's supervision and control, shall provide authoritative interpretations of law for the executive branch. These opinions are controlling on all employees in the conduct of their official duties. The struggle over how far Mr. Trump will get in realizing such ambitions will roil American politics between now and the midterm elections in 2026. The courts are adjudicating a glut of cases, which will take months to decide and perhaps years to exhaust appeals. Lawsuits by Harvard University and law firms targeted by Mr. Trump may offer the Supreme Court an opportunity to stop or limit Mr. Trump's attempt to coerce civil society. In the meantime, the administration is howling over blocks imposed by district judges, In some cases, it has been inching worryingly close to defying court orders. Partisanship has so addled Congress that it is unable to defend even authorities it has long guarded jealously, like setting budgets. Over decades, Congress has voluntarily given away its institutional powers to oversee commerce, trade, federal agencies, even warfare. Republican members today vent their frustrations about the president in private, but their fear of losing the next primary election keeps them from going public. Respect for Congress's ability to set laws is deteriorating. Mr. Trump has decided to ignore a law to force the sale of TikTok, passed by large bipartisan majorities last year, on vague national security grounds. The most serious blow may yet be to fall. Mr. Trump has made clear that he intends to explicitly impound, or not spend, funds that Congress has allocated by law if they conflict with his policy priorities. If successful, this would obliterate Congress's power of the purse. With the legislative branch inert, the burden of checking Mr. Trump has fallen to the courts. The next months will require deft mastery of politics by the Supreme Court's Chief Justice John Roberts. Mr. Trump is angling for a showdown with the Supreme Court, says Lee Drutman, a political scientist. A sweeping decision by the High Court involving a particularly unsympathetic plaintiff, or one that provokes a sharp ideological dissent from Trump-aligned justices, might push Mr. Trump to ignore both the letter and the spirit of the court's ruling. That would unambiguously puncture the Constitution. The Chief Justice does not appear to be seeking confrontation, but the court has scheduled oral arguments in May about the administration's attempt to end birthright citizenship. It is hard to imagine the judgment going Mr. Trump's way, since the Constitution says point blank that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. The High Court is likely to consider Mr. Trump's other actions through the so-called emergency docket. If the administration continues to ignore district judges, Chief Justice Roberts' polite and deferential language might take on a harder edge. Americans venerate their Constitution, but its authority and limitations are sustained by collective belief. In the force of a rogue executive, the Constitution's checks could become as fragile as the parchment it was written on. Even the law enforcement officers available to enforce the orders of judges, the federal court marshals, report to the Department of Justice, or DOJ. Mr. Trump's centralization of power in the executive branch to the detriment of the legislative and judicial branches is so consequential that it is easy to miss another, potentially even more important development, the abolition of checks and balances within the executive branch itself. The President's executive orders had previously been reviewed by the DOJ's Office of Legal Counsel, or OLC, to ensure compliance with existing laws. Mr. Trump has largely cut out the OLC. They have self-consciously and successfully eliminated all internal executive branch legal and norm-based constraints on Trump's will, period, says Jack Goldsmith, a Harvard law professor who led the office under George W. Bush. The civil service is not just going through personnel cuts, but also loyalty tests. Nowhere is politicization more worrying than in law enforcement agencies. What we've seen in the Department of Justice is the wholesale elimination of its independence, says Paul Rosenzweig, who also worked in the Bush administration. The post-Watergate norm of an arm's-length DOJ is over. Mr. Trump's actions risk creating a two-track legal system, says Aziz Haq, a law professor at the University of Chicago, one where property rights are enforced as usual by the courts, except where the government decides they can pull this switch, a trapdoor opens beneath you, and you vanish into this realm in which you're at the whim of powerful political actors. This is the model of the dual state, often used to describe China and Singapore. Given that Republicans will enjoy their majorities until at least 2027, there is little chance that Congress will revive itself before then. That would only change if Mr. Trump were to face broad protests and suffer a dramatic decline in approval because of acts of economic self-harm, like resumption of his reciprocal tariffs. There are few possible paths for self-correction within the executive branch itself, given the fixed will of the president. The defence of the Republic will fall in large measure to Chief Justice Roberts and his colleagues, armed with the power of the pen and faith in the separation of powers.
United States.
Lawfare. Protection rackets. How Donald Trump's attack on civil society might be checked.
In February 2018, a teenager shot down and killed 14 high schoolers in Parkland, Florida. As the country reeled, a New York government official sought to weaken America's gun lobby. Maria Vullo, head of the state's financial services regulator, told Lloyd's of London that if it stopped providing insurance to the National Rifle Association, or NRA, the government wouldn't investigate it for regulatory infractions. Lloyd's took the deal and the NRA sued, arguing that choking its business for political reasons violated the First Amendment. Last year, the Supreme Court agreed unanimously. Government officials cannot attempt to coerce private parties in order to punish or suppress views that the government disfavours. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote for the justices in NRA versus Vullo. Coercion of institutions whose views Donald Trump disfavours has been a signature of his second term. Will he be checked? The Vullo ruling suggests that Mr. Trump's widening assaults on American civil society are unconstitutional. Since taking office, he has ejected a news agency from the Oval Office for its choice of words and told Harvard University that it will lose funding unless it enforces viewpoint diversity under government oversight. He could soon go after non-profits by removing their tax exemptions. Many of his targets have been reluctant to sue, fearing escalation. But a handful of elite law firms have, and their cases are moving quickly enough that the Supreme Court may soon be forced to act on the principles it enunciated in Vullo. Mr. Trump's attacks on law firms began as unabashed vengeance-seeking. In February, he started targeting firms which represented his political foes and employed people he dislikes. His first executive order stripped Covington and Burling of its security clearances. Next came Perkins Coie, Paul Weiss, Wilmer Hale and two others, whose lawyers lost access to federal buildings and whose clients were warned that working with the firms would put their government contracts at risk. Panic ensued. Many of these firms' top clients rely on Washington contracts and could leave for less controversial firms. The administration forced a choice. Work for us and people we like or we'll put you out of business, explains Scott Cummings, a legal ethicist at the University of California, Los Angeles. In Viktor Orban's Hungary, he notes, a similar ultimatum left the legal industry with no firms that outwardly oppose the country's autocrat. The shakedown worked, partly. Paul Weiss found its way back into Mr. Trump's favour by pledging $40 million of pro bono work for his pet causes. Another 8 firms have since struck deals, together offering an additional $900 million of free labour. But 4 firms sued. Top lawyers like Paul Clement, who has argued over 100 Supreme Court cases, and Dane Butts-Winkas, who was briefly Tesla's general counsel, chose to represent them. Their arguments echo those of the NRA. Pressing clients to sever ties because of cases the firms have taken on infringes on their right to free speech. In addition, they argue that the administration violated the client's right to counsel and the firm's right to due process by imposing sanctions without giving them the opportunity to defend themselves. This is the one domain where the president has met the most resistance from conservatives, says Greg Nunziata, a prominent right-wing lawyer. The value of representing unpopular causes is sacrosanct, and big firms have the resources to sue politicians in power. Sussman Godfrey, the latest firm to come under attack, litigates election cases. That caught the eye of a president who has mused about seeking a third term. 4 district judges have temporarily blocked parts of Mr. Trump's orders, and the firms are seeking permanent relief. The case law that emerges from their battle will shape the fate of universities and non-profits. Part of the Trump administration's pressure on Harvard and Columbia University has leveraged the Civil Rights Act to enforce changes, a tactic Democratic presidents have used to promote gender equality. But the Trump administration has also distinctively insisted it has the right to control what universities teach and whom they hire. On April 21st, Harvard filed a lawsuit against the administration, accusing it of flouting the First Amendment, among other offences. The early success of law firms which decided to fight hasn't convinced other targeted institutions to stop settling, but cutting deals is not proving to be the end of it. After pledging to give itself the makeover the administration demanded, Columbia University has not had its funding restored. And law firms that donated pro bono time may soon find themselves in more agony. Mr. Trump has spoken about using them to broker coal leases and trade deals with countries hit with tariffs. White House officials reportedly said the firms that settled may be asked to represent the president himself. Sheila Heen of the Harvard Negotiation Project is advising bosses to do something she never normally suggests: don't negotiate. The punishment for disloyalty, she reckons, only gets worse once you are his.
United States.
Deregulation. Chainsaws on. Donald Trump hopes to become a one-man deregulator.
Few Republican politicians dare criticize Donald Trump publicly, but many harbour doubts about the president's violations of party orthodoxy on economics and foreign policy. One issue, however, can still unite Trumpian populists and Reaganists: deregulation. Early on, the president has brought the same enthusiasm for paring back the administrative state as in his first term, but this time he is defying norms to get the work done faster. The laws passed by Congress can be vague, sometimes deliberately so to reflect political compromise. The details are filled in by regulatory agencies within boundaries set by the Administrative Procedures Act, or APA. If agencies don't adhere to the Act, then their regulation or deregulation can be struck down by courts. This can be a slow process. The President has pledged to go even harder and faster on deregulation than he did in his first term, by going around the APA. Some of Mr. Trump's methods resemble those of his first presidency. The Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, is coordinating across the government to oversee deregulatory action. In February, the President ordered aides to work with the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, and the OMB to rescind unlawful regulations that impose significant costs upon private parties that are not outweighed by public benefits. Mr. Trump took this much further on April 9th when he issued a directive undermining the APA. Passed in 1946, the law created a structure for adopting and rescinding regulations, notably requiring a lengthy notice and comment period before rules can be enacted or overturned. Citing recent Supreme Court cases, the administration says it plans to overlook these procedures and immediately repeal regulations it doesn't like. Energy and environmental regulation will be two areas where Mr. Trump will test this method. He is particularly happy with Lee Zeldin, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, administrator, for moving quickly to dismantle Biden-era regulations, including climate rules that affect energy production and vehicle emissions. And the administration has set a goal to increase energy production. The downsizing at federal departments such as the EPA and the Internal Revenue Service, inspired by DOGE, aims to loosen the government's grip on most businesses, while tightening it on some of those that incur the president's displeasure. During the presidential transition, Mr. Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, then a co-leader of the effort, argued that deregulation would mean the government needed far fewer civil servants. So far, though, reductions in headcount have come faster than reductions in regulation. And lasting deregulation typically requires expert personnel to write effective new rules that will withstand scrutiny by the courts. While administration officials expressed confidence in their strategy, the legality of Mr. Trump's plan to swiftly jettison federal rules is untested. Courts probably won't go along with the administration's sweeping interpretation of its powers to ignore the APA, but they could look favourably at revoking regulations that lack a direct connection to a law passed by Congress, says Susan Dudley, who was head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs under President George W. Bush. The administration says it will take out 10 existing regulations for every new one introduced, an increase over the 2-to-1 ratio Mr. Trump promised in his first term. That was already inflated. It is easy to cut regulations for obsolete products, say, without doing anything to boost growth. Mr. Trump's team sees things differently. Economists always underappreciate the role of regulations, argues Stephen Myron, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers. When you look at what determines productive capacity, what determines the ability of firms to produce to meet consumer demand, the regulatory side is just so important. Yet some of the president's early deregulatory actions smack of self-dealing and corruption, and may provoke a political backlash. It's clear that industries or people close to Trump are benefiting. Crypto is seeing rules loosen while safeguards for self-driving cars are being removed, something that benefits Elon Musk and Tesla, notes David Super, a law professor at Georgetown University. Don't expect much deregulation from Congress, the ultimate source of most of the rules in the first place. Some members still believe that bipartisan permitting reform is still possible, but it has been discussed for years without yielding a law. There is a perennial debate in American politics about whether deregulation will unleash growth by removing unnecessary red tape, or will merely jeopardize citizens' safety to little economic benefit. The effects of financial regulation, with its unanticipated second-order consequences, can be even harder to judge. Mr. Trump's efforts to deregulate, constantly evolving, will be difficult to evaluate in the short run. But the direction of travel is clear.
United States.
Immigration. Primed for removals. A gusher of funds from Congress could accelerate deportations.
It has been hard to keep track of the blitz of new immigration policies that President Donald Trump has introduced since taking office in January. During the first 100 days of his second presidency, he has tried to end birthright citizenship, used war powers to deport alleged gang members to El Salvador, revoked the visas of more than 1,700 international students and recent graduates, and classified some 6,000 migrants as dead in order to cancel their social security cards and encourage them to self-deport. That is just a short list. His attempts so far to expel illegal and legal immigrants have tested the limits of presidential power and run roughshod over due process. Yet for all the upheaval Mr. Trump has provoked, deportations don't seem to be increasing. Data are sparse, but leaked figures and some official statistics indicate that the pace of deportations may be trailing that of President Joe Biden's final year in office, largely because irregular crossings at the southern border have fallen to the lowest level in decades. Migrant encounters began falling last year after Mexico cracked down and Mr. Biden restricted asylum. Mr. Trump's tough talk, his deployment of the army, and the effective end of asylum at the border have depressed crossings further. A quieter border almost certainly slows the pace of deportations. During the previous fiscal year, some 87% of removals were the result of arrests made at the frontier. With crossings so low, increasing deportations requires finding more illegal immigrants where they live and work in America's interior, and that was always going to be hard to do. But Mr. Trump may soon get some help. Republicans in Congress are negotiating a budget bill that could increase funding for immigration enforcement by anywhere from $90 billion to $175 billion over the next decade. The annual budget for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, the agency that carries out deportations, is just $9 billion. A funding windfall combined with increased cooperation from local law enforcement in Republican states and the potential use of the armed forces could unlock a more aggressive phase of Mr. Trump's deportation campaign. First, consider Congress's financial contribution. The most important pressing need for that money is detention, says Mark Krikorian, the executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies, an anti-immigration think tank aligned with the administration. It's easier to remove someone from the country if they are already in custody, but ICE's detention centres are full. ICE will look for new places to detain people by reopening old jails, building tent camps on military bases, and partnering with private prison firms to construct and run new facilities, costing up to $45 billion. Money will also be funneled to government contractors, which can use technology to track migrants and move them around. ICE will pay Palantir, a software firm used by spooks, $30 million to monitor self-deporting migrants. At a recent Border Security Expo in Phoenix, Todd Lyons, the acting director of ICE, said the agency should resemble a logistics business like Amazon Prime, but with human beings. To step up deportations, ICE needs more agents. It is strengthening what are known as 287G agreements, which deputize local law enforcement officers as federal immigration agents. As of April 17th, 456 sheriff and police departments or state agencies were working with ICE, 70% of which have signed on to the program since Mr. Trump's inauguration. Most participating agencies are in states that Mr. Trump won in November, but the list also includes several sheriff departments in conservative corners of Democratic states. Florida, home to at least 1.2 million unauthorized immigrants, passed a law in 2022 compelling each county that operates a detention center to join the program. Finally, there is a question about whether Mr. Trump envisages a role for the army in his deportation campaign. More than 9,600 troops are set to patrol the border, and on April 11th, Mr. Trump directed the Defense Department to take control of a small strip of public land north of a section of the border wall. The armed forces are barred from taking part in domestic law enforcement by a Reconstruction-era law called the Posse Comitatus Act. Elizabeth Goiton of the Brennan Center for Justice, a left-leaning think tank, reckons the order is an attempt to evade that law. From the administration's perspective, if a migrant jumps the wall, they are trespassing on a military facility, and as such they can be apprehended and removed without violating Posse Comitatus, she notes. The same law prevents Mr. Trump from sending soldiers to help ICE arrest migrants on the street. That is, unless the president were to invoke the Insurrection Act, which overrides Posse Comitatus and allows a president to deploy the army at home, a power most often used to break up riots. The use of the Insurrection Act for immigration reasons would be unprecedented and has the potential to create conflict between soldiers untrained in respecting civil liberties and citizens of cities and states who may resent their presence. An April 20th deadline for the Secretaries of Defense and Homeland Security, Pete Hegseth and Kristi Noem, to recommend whether the act should be invoked passed without clarity about how the administration will proceed. Invoking the act at some point would fit Mr. Trump's pattern of relying on emergency powers. The administration is throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, says Ms. Goiton. What sticks will be determined by the courts and whether Mr. Trump abides by the decisions of the judiciary. Worryingly, that is no longer a sure thing. At least 42 immigration actions are already being litigated, according to the Immigration Policy Tracking Project, run by Lucas Gutentag of Stanford University. One federal judge launched contempt proceedings, which are temporarily on hold, to determine whether the administration willfully defied his order to halt deportations to El Salvador under the Alien Enemies Act. He may not be the last.
United States.
Social media. The Proust of Truth Social. The tweeter-in-chief is very, very online.
America's presidency is often called the hardest job in the world. Yet Donald Trump has found time to moonlight as a prolific social media influencer. Since January 20th, he has churned out 4,149 words a week on Truth Social and X, nearly a newspaper op-ed every day. If he keeps it up, his total oeuvre as president will surpass Marcel Proust's 1.3 million-word Remembrance of Things Past in early 2028. Mr. Trump's current output dwarfs not only that of his predecessors and their running mates, Barack Obama, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, all averaged 400 to 600 words a week, but also his own benchmarks. In the first 100 days of his first term, he plodded along at 686 a week, but sped up to 4,919 during the presidential campaign of 2020. The sharpest increase occurred in 2019, when he extended the end of his standard posting hours, which began around 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time, from roughly midnight to 2 a.m. or so. In any given week, the president's social media use is as unpredictable as his policy-making. However, keen followers might notice that he is most prone to take to the keyboard when he is emboldened, and least when he feels chastened. After accounting for the overall increase in his posting frequency over time, he tends to go dark online when his approval rating is unusually low, such as during the government shutdown he instigated in late 2018, the aftermath of his defeat in the election of 2020, and the disastrous rollout of his Liberation Day tariffs this month. Mr. Trump's feed differs from its first-term incarnation in content as well as volume. Based on the NRC Emotion Lexicon, a dictionary that assigns a range of feelings to different words, his vocabulary is much less emotional this time around, largely because he is no longer facing the instigations and lawsuits that used to trigger his online ire. Mr. Vance's posts, in contrast, are unusually emotionally charged. "I hate this smug, self-assured bullshit," he recently wrote in response to a journalist's tweet. The biggest changes in the topics of presidential missives, which we identified by feeding them into a large language model, simply reflect the news of the day. In 2017, Mr. Trump wrote much more about Mr. Obama, Hillary Clinton, travel bans, investigations of Russian collusion, and repealing the Affordable Care Act. Today, he focuses on tariffs and trade, the war in Ukraine, transgender athletes, and Mr. Biden. However, there are also some telling discrepancies. Compared with the first 100 days of his first term, Mr. Trump avoids discussing jobs and the economy, which, thanks to his tariffs, are now among his worst polling issues, and spends less time criticizing the media. Conversely, he writes more about bias and weaponization in the legal system, the scope of his own power and, almost above all, himself. The share of his posts that are algorithm classified as Trump-related terms and topics has risen from 7% in his first term to over 16% since January 20th.
United States.
Tariff wars. Will the levies break? Expect more zigzags in Donald Trump's trade policies.
Donald Trump has never been shy about expressing his fondness for tariffs. But prior to his return to the White House, many of his supporters thought it more of a negotiating ploy, an aggressive stance meant to prod other countries into concessions. This comforting story now looks like a fantasy. Mr. Trump has shown himself to be a true believer in trade protectionism. In the process, he has raised the average effective tariff on goods entering America from 2.5% last year to about 20%, the highest since the Great Depression. The policy process has been chaotic, to put it politely, and that disorder offers a forecast of how Mr. Trump may swerve and improvise towards an outcome that preserves as much of his vision of a remade American trade regime as markets, courts, and the Republican Party will allow. To judge where he may end up, it is useful to remember where he began. On the campaign trail, Mr. Trump spoke of a universal tariff of 10 to 20% and a China-specific levy of 60%. If only things had been that tidy. Instead, Mr. Trump has thrown together a hodgepodge of product-focused and country-specific levies, only to roll back some, pause others, and threaten still more. In his first term, Mr. Trump relied on statutes that allow the White House to impose limited tariffs. This time, he has invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, a law that grants the president far greater leeway. For Canada and Mexico, he declared an emergency over fentanyl smuggling and illegal immigration. For reciprocal tariffs on all countries, he said that trade deficits themselves constituted an emergency. What might restrain Mr. Trump in the months ahead? The courts are one potential break. Previous presidents had used IEPA to justify targeted sanctions, but never tariffs. The White House now faces multiple lawsuits alleging that Mr. Trump has exceeded his authority. Yet courts have traditionally deferred to the president over claims of national security, so success for the plaintiffs is uncertain. It is possible but unlikely that Congress could wake from its slumber and resist. 4 Republican senators recently joined their Democratic colleagues to pass a resolution that would end the tariffs on Canada by revoking Mr. Trump's declaration of a national emergency. But that resolution fizzled out without Republican backing in the House of Representatives. Republicans might become more assertive if it became clear that tariffs are hurting the economy and that popular support for Mr. Trump is falling. Things could be moving in that direction. Consumer confidence has already plunged, and businesses are reining in investments. Stocks, bonds, and the dollar are all down since Mr. Trump announced his widest-ranging tariffs on April 2nd, which he branded Liberation Day. That realization could arrive before the year is out. Mr. Trump says he is willing to endure short-term pain, but he is sensitive to market turmoil. His 90-day pause of his reciprocal tariffs, announced just a week after Liberation Day, is evidence of that. The official rationale was to hold bilateral trade talks. Mr. Trump claims that countries are lining up to kiss his posterior. The reality is of slow progress. Negotiations are underway with a few dozen countries, yet diplomats bemoan a lack of clarity about what they can offer to placate Mr. Trump. Some still think he wants a grand bargain with China, but for now, dialogue between the two powers is virtually non-existent. Instead, smaller deals, light on details, look more likely in the coming months, perhaps starting with Japan or India. All going well, Mr. Trump would probably like the next scene in his trade war to be a moment of vindication, a signing ceremony in the Rose Garden, and a declaration that his coercive strategy has been a great success. But make no mistake, while Mr. Trump is in the White House, there will be no going back to any semblance of America's era as a champion and architect of free trade.
China.
Pronatalism. Oh, baby. New ideas for new people in an old country.
In the northern Chinese city of Ho-Hot, Ms. Liu and her colleagues at a baby goods store are constantly having to think of new ways to boost business. Recently, they and many of their competitors have started to give out baby formula samples at the entrance of a maternity hospital around the corner. Their city, capital of the region of Inner Mongolia, may be home to two of the world's largest dairy companies, but the people of Ho Hot are making fewer babies to drink that milk. China, like South Korea, is facing a dramatic decline in its fertility rate. Last year, the country's population shrank for the third consecutive year, and the marriage rate plummeted by 21% to a record low. The rapidly ageing population is reliant on an ever smaller workforce. That has the state worried as it struggles to turn around a slowing post-COVID economy. Attempts to tackle the problem have taken on a new urgency. Leaders for the first time promised childcare subsidies and free school education in the annual work report at China's parliament last month to try to further encourage procreation. While the central government works out details of its fertility-boosting plan, local governments have stepped in. 2 provinces and at least 20 cities, including Ho Hot, have offered childcare subsidies, typically larger for the second and third children. There are signs that some of the policies might be having some impact. Tiananmen, a small city in central China, has gone all out, introducing packages totaling up to 280,000 yuan, that's $38,000, including maternity leave and housing subsidies. In 2024, the city recorded a 17% increase in births after 8 years of decline, though the baby boom also coincided with migrants coming back to the city and the arrival of the Year of the Dragon, considered auspicious for births. Tiananmen recognized that for many women, having children is not just about the money. It even established a system to promote the career advancement of parents with 2 or 3 children. In Ho Hot, however, the uptake so far appears weak. On March 13th, with fanfare in national media, the city announced one of the biggest Cash for Kids schemes in the country. Mothers will now be paid 10,000 yuan for a first child, 50,000 yuan over 5 years for a second, and 100,000 yuan over 10 years for a third. That third child reward is double the city's average annual salary. But Ho Hot is not offering much beyond the cash payments, and at one local office that processes subsidy registrations, an employee said that they have received only 7 or 8 inquiries in the month since the policy announcement. Ms. Liu at the baby store, who is 35 and has 1 child, said she would like to have a second if she had more money, but the new incentives do not offset the lack of childcare support and the high costs of raising children in a competitive environment. The policy might change the minds of people on the fence about having kids, but people like me won't consider it, she says. For Ms. Wu, a 29-year-old civil servant about to give birth to her first child, the 10,000 yuan adds flowers to the brocade and could help with her mortgage or car loan, but 50,000 yuan is not going to cover the costs of a second child. It costs high-income families 1.3 million yuan to raise a child to adulthood, estimates Yuhua Population Research Institute, a think tank in Beijing. The figure is more like 130,000 yuan for low-income families. Wang Feng of the University of California, Irvine, thinks Ho Hot's policy will not make a dent in the city's population decline. Babies cannot be bought, he says. The cost is lifelong, and it's not just monetary. Mr. Wang does, however, believe that financial support for young families is worthwhile. Childcare subsidies are targeted cash transfers, aligned with another national priority, increasing domestic consumption. Applying Ho Hot standards nationwide could see as much as 95 billion yuan transferred to families in the first year, equal to about 0.07% of GDP, reckons Citi, the bank. But widespread rollout would require more resources from the central government, as cash-strapped local governments may struggle to foot the bill. Cultural changes also dim the allure of such payouts. Walking her dog in a Ho-Hot park, Ms. Guo says she devoted her golden years to child-rearing, placing her own aspirations on hold. The 50-year-old told her two daughters to prioritise their own happiness, warning them not to get married or have kids at the cost of their own well-being. Once you have children, you can't shove them back in, she says. Finally carving out more time for yoga training, she has made clear that she will not look after any grandchildren, rejecting the expectations long imposed on Chinese grandparents. Ho-Hot's announcement may have sent dairy producers' stock prices up, but don't expect the baby formula to be flying off the shelves just yet.
China.
Imports from America. A bean is a bean. But high-end imports are more difficult to replace.
As President Donald Trump has a habit of pointing out, China sells a lot more to America than the other way round. It ran a trade surplus of nearly $300 billion last year. The gigantic 145% levy Mr. Trump has slapped on most Chinese goods in response is clearly hurting Chinese exporters. But importers are being affected too. Last year, China bought $145 billion worth of stuff from America, and after China's own tit-for-tat tariff rises, these goods are now subject to a 125% levy when they enter the country, enough to make many American goods unaffordable. How big a problem this is depends on whether China can find replacements. For simple goods, which are easy to produce, that should be straightforward, but finding alternative sources for more complex, hard-to-make goods is a bigger challenge. Though the bulk of China's imports from America are fairly simple, it still buys a few very complex goods from the United States. It is these that may be giving policymakers in Beijing a headache. China's biggest imports from America are agricultural commodities, which are fairly easy to replace. A bean is a bean is a bean, notes Even Pei of Trivium China, a consultancy. The most important bean in question is the soybean, which feeds China's vast pig herd. In 2017, at the start of Mr. Trump's first term, some 40% of China's soybean imports came from America. Now only 18% do, thanks to Chinese moves to buy more beans from other countries, such as Brazil. Chinese domestic soybean production will probably pick up this year too, says Ms. Pei. China can drop other American commodities even more easily. In March, the country bought no American wheat or liquefied natural gas. Last year, America provided 17% and 5% respectively of Chinese imports of those goods. Western-style restaurants in Beijing are already switching to Australian beef. But more complex American goods are harder to switch. One example is pharmaceuticals. Although China manufactures lots of generic drugs for the American market, the trade in high-end products often goes the other way. Tariffs have got Chinese hospitals worried. Some American-made cancer treatments, for instance, will be very hard to replace once stocks run out, says a hospital administrator in Beijing. American factories also supply China with treatments for conditions such as haemophilia. Over 40% of China's imports of albumin, a protein extracted from human blood which is used to make medicines, comes from America. China's aerospace industry relies heavily on American planes and parts. In mid-April, at least 2 jets made by Boeing, intended for use by Chinese airlines, were flown back to America. With an original price tag of $55 million each, the tariff had made them unaffordable. About half of China's total passenger jet fleet is made by Boeing. Maintaining the planes will be hard without access to new parts, says Rob Morris of Cirium, a consultancy. Production of the C919, China's homegrown passenger aircraft, may also be affected, as crucial components, including its engines, are made using American parts. These pressures may force China to quietly exempt certain goods from tariffs, as it did during Mr. Trump's first term. America has already made the first move. On April 12th, Mr. Trump said he would not levy the highest level of tariffs on Chinese-made computers and smartphones, for which there are few alternatives for American consumers. That may give China an excuse to carve out its own exceptions without looking weak. A simple solution for a complex problem.
Business.
Volkswagen. From bad to worst. At least the car maker's sausage sales are on a roll.
Volkswagen's days of producing a global icon may have seemed behind it. But last month, Gunnar Kilian, who sits on the management board of Europe's biggest car maker, gushed on LinkedIn that VW had done just that. Mr. Kilian was not raving about a fancy new car model, though. VW's very own currywurst, a German sausage with spicy tomato sauce, has become, he declared, a cult product with international bestseller status. Last year, VW sold 8.5 million sausages in its corporate canteens, the Wolfsburg football stadium and supermarkets, 200,000 more than in 2023. Around 6 million were currywurst, 2 million were unadorned frankfurters. And cars? The company sold just 5.2 million VW-branded vehicles, a shade down from the year before. The VW Group, which includes Audi, Seat, Skoda and Porsche, sold 9 million vehicles as a whole, also fewer than in 2023. That raises the tantalizing prospect that VW could soon sell more sausages than cars. It is an unusual kind of diversification, and one that reflects the hard times that have befallen the company. Last year, the carmaker's net profit dropped by nearly a third. Demand from China slumped, while a bloated workforce kept costs high. A protracted and bitter battle with union leaders over job cuts and factory closures ended in December with an agreement to keep all 10 of VW's German plants open, but to shed 35,000 jobs by 2030, or around 1/4 of the company's domestic workforce, in a socially responsible manner, meaning through retirement and other voluntary attrition. Management had the good sense, at least, not to get between its workers and their currywurst. When in 21 VW wanted the canteen at its headquarters in Wolfsburg to forego its meaty sausages and switch to vegetarian food, it faced a rebellion. Even Gerhard Schröder, a former chancellor, weighed in. The currywurst is the power bar of the factory worker, he proclaimed. By 2023, the sausage was back on the menu. When it comes to car making, this year may prove even harder to swallow for VW than the last. In 2024, it increased its sales in America by 3%, a rare spot of growth for the company. New tariffs on imported vehicles mean it is unlikely to repeat the performance. 4/5 of the cars VW sold in America last year were produced elsewhere. The outlook for its sausage business, though, seems brighter. Our next currywurst coup is already in the works, Mr. Kilian has promised. It could be yet another version of the sausage. VW has already begun making vegetarian, vegan and halal varieties. Amid a difficult year, the worst innovation may be the best news to come out of Wolfsburg.
Business.
Trade war. President Grinch. How Donald Trump might steal Christmas.
Times are bleak in Toyland, so bleak that Bratz dolls' flowing locks are at risk. There is no American factory anywhere that can make hair for dolls, fumes Isaac Larian, boss of MGA Entertainment, the Los Angeles company that makes the fashion figurines. What am I supposed to do, sell bald dolls? The killjoy behind all the gloom? Donald Trump. The president's tariffs are proving particularly burdensome for toy makers. Around 80% of toys sold in America are made in China, the main target in Mr. Trump's trade war. Levies of 145% on Chinese goods are clobbering an industry specializing in churning out cheap delights for children, often at low margins. Parents may be willing to spend $15 on a Care Bear, cut, sewn and filled in China, even if it is played with only once. At $36, though, they may tell sellers to get stuffed. More than monopoly money is at stake. Toy sales in America are worth about $30 billion a year, according to UBS, a bank. The share price of Mattel, the largest listed toy maker, has fallen by about a quarter since Mr. Trump imposed additional tariffs on China on April 2nd. They reached 145% the next week. Hasbro, another leading toy maker, has also seen its value drop, and both are better insulated than most, having already started to shift their supply chains away from China. Mattel intends that by 2027, no country should provide more than a quarter of its global output. Smaller firms with less scope to split production are more exposed. A hurried charm offensive is underway. The Toy Association, an industry group, was a keen news sponsor of the White House's annual egg roll on Easter Monday. Toy makers have been showering lawmakers with reminders that parents, read voters, like to buy presents for their children. The industry's hopes have been lifted by the reprieve from tariffs that Mr. Trump granted for smartphones, laptops, and other toys for grown-ups. On April 22nd, the president hinted that duties on Chinese goods might drop across the board. But how far and when? Even a $25 Care Bear might be a hard sell, and finding alternatives to Chinese imports, such as reshoring to America, takes more than a magic wand. Lego, the world's biggest toy maker, is opening its first American factory in 2027, 5 years after announcing it. Toys with more sophisticated components pose additional problems. Making a plaything that moves or squeaks requires a whole network of Chinese factories, points out Jay Foreman, boss of Basic Fun, another toy firm. Moving it would not be easy, and in the meantime, tariffs will bite. Nearly half of the small and medium-sized firms surveyed by the Toy Association think that with the current tariffs, they will go out of business within months. Greg Ahern, the head of the Toy Association, says that while his members wait for a reprieve, their manufacturing in China has ground to a halt. It may be only April, but production for Christmas would usually be in full swing. Every week this goes on is a week of peak production that we're missing out on, he adds. Christmas is at risk. Time is getting tight for a fairy tale ending.
Business.
Retail. Mall mercies. Shopping centres are making a comeback in America.
This is where people of today's world hang out, explained Bill Preston, a student to Socrates. Mr. Preston was not your typical member of the Socratic Circle. The year was 1988, and they were riding the escalator at a mall. That the makers behind Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, a film about two high schoolers transporting historical figures to their present day, chose this setting is unsurprising. Since America's first fully enclosed mall opened in Minnesota in 1956, thousands had sprung up across the country. Malls were the new agora where the demos came to eat, shop and indeed hang out. Today, some 900 are left operating in America. The rise of e-commerce and the decline of the department store, the traditional anchor tenant for most malls, have led to hundreds of them closing their doors for good over the past decade. Among them, the Metro Center in Arizona, the filming location for the fictional mall that Socrates once roamed. Pandemic lockdowns hastened the demise of many. Yet investors have lately taken a renewed interest in these temples of consumerism. The market value of Simon Property Group, the largest owner of American malls, rose by half between the start of 2023 and the end of 2024, approaching an all-time high. The value of Macerich, another big mall operator, increased by 4/5. What explains the revival, and can it last? The mall business is split between the haves and have-nots, explains Ronald Camden of Morgan Stanley, a bank. While dingy sites in undesirable locations have shut down, football at so-called A-malls has bounced back roughly to pre-pandemic levels. Successful owners such as Simon and Macerich have focused on these sites. Retailers, meanwhile, have begun to recognise the limits of e-commerce. Online sales, as a share of total retail spending in America, have yet to rise above 16%, the level reached in the second quarter of 2020. Many brands that began selling on the internet have now embraced bricks and mortar. Warby Parker, once an online purveyor of spectacles, hopes to have some 900 stores in future, roughly triple the number today, and around 4/5 of luxury goods are still sold in physical shops, reckons Bain, a consultancy. For mall owners, it helps that top-notch retail space is in short supply. At around 4%, America's retail vacancy rate is near an all-time low. Construction has been sluggish, a problem that will be made worse by Donald Trump's tariffs on building materials such as steel and his determination to deport the migrant workers on whom the construction industry relies. No wonder that around half of new luxury shops in America open in high-end malls. Even youngsters inseparable from their smartphones are heading to malls, lured in part by the promise of novel in-person experiences. This year, Netflix will open its first experiential entertainment venues in 2 former department stores in malls. Ted Sarandos, its boss, has suggested that 50 or so of them may open in the coming years. Mall owners hope to convert youngsters into the next generation of Bills and Teds. Last year, Simon launched a marketing campaign targeted at Gen Z shoppers called Meet Me at the Mall. Challenges lie ahead. On April 22nd, the IMF downgraded its forecast for American GDP growth this year, signalling weaker prospects for consumer spending. Shares in Simon and Macerich have slumped since Mr. Trump launched his trade war on April 2nd. Yet malls could prove more resilient than in previous slowdowns, argues Vince Tiboni of Green Street, a property research firm, thanks to the short supply of retail space and the fact that many weaker tenants already went bankrupt during the pandemic. Plenty more excellent adventures, it seems, are still to be had.
Business.
Bartleby. From cot to corner office. How formative experiences shape managers.
What's your greatest weakness? Why do you want this job? And were you exposed to toxic chemicals in the womb? Some interview questions are familiar to the point of overuse. Some never get asked. Early experiences, all the way from fetus to first job, can influence the way people behave at work decades later. In a paper published in 2023, Raghavendra Rao of the University of Cambridge and his co-authors looked at the effect of being born in heavily polluted parts of America on the risk-taking preferences of chief executives. The researchers found that CEOs who had been born in areas later designated as Superfund sites, meaning they are contaminated with hazardous chemicals, took more risks than their counterparts, and that these risks tended not to pay off. The authors hypothesize that pollution had affected bosses' brain development. Mr. Rao, along with Gennaro Benile of the University of Miami and Vineet Bhagwat of George Washington University, has also looked into the effect of early exposure to natural disasters on bosses. In a 2014 paper, the academics compared country-level records of tornadoes, earthquakes, and the like with the biographical information of CEOs born in America to infer how likely they were to have experienced a natural disaster between the ages of 5 and 15. Bosses who probably experienced a disaster in their childhood that claimed many lives tended to be more cautious in their use of leverage and hold more cash than bosses who likely did not experience a fatal disaster. But disasters that caused only a few deaths were associated with greater risk-taking behavior on the part of CEOs who endured them. If risks do not have extreme consequences, the authors hypothesize, they may seem more worth taking. Early life experiences do not just have an impact on risk appetite. Corporate directors in America who have gone through an extreme disaster are associated with firms that have lower carbon emissions. In China, regional politicians who were relocated as youths to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution are more likely than their counterparts to implement policies favourable to the rural poor. Family environments ripple through the decades to affect decisions on capital allocation. Researchers find that CEOs who grew up in homes where the father was the sole earner and more educated than the mother go on to give male division managers more generous budgets than female managers. Unsurprisingly, the economic backdrop also exerts an effect on the big cheeses of the future. In 2017, Antoinette Chouard of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Luo Zhuo of the National University of Singapore looked at the career histories of over 2,000 bosses of American firms to identify whether their working lives began during a recession or not. They found that these recession CEOs were more conservative managers, skimping on costs and cutting back on leverage, compared with bosses who got their first paychecks in a growing economy. This difference stems in part from the effect that downturns have on the kinds of jobs people get when they enter the workforce. Recession CEOs are more likely to start off in smaller or private firms, with lasting effects on how they manage and where they end up. Early career economies also affect professional investors. A recent study by Zhe Chen of Leeds University and his co-authors found that fund managers who started out in a recession produced better returns than those who did not. So what, you might ask? The people are shaped by their experiences is not surprising, just as demography is not destiny, nor are disasters, downturns, or developmental issues. Individuals can buck trends as well as conform to them. No one should be selecting candidates on the basis of their formative years. And if you're going to worry about the victims of adverse events, future CEOs would not be top of the list. But there are 3 good reasons to pay attention to research of this kind. First, it is a reminder that bosses are shaped by events and environments beyond their control. Luck plays a part in career success as well as talent. Second, it adds to the arguments for a diversity of experience in organizations. Third, it suggests that current events may cast a very long shadow. As America flirts with the possibility of a self-inflicted recession, the consequences for managers as well as workers could endure far beyond a single business cycle.
Business.
Schumpeter. The Great Robot Race. Watch out, Elon Musk. Chinese automatons are nipping at Tesla's heels.
And they're off. Well, some of them. One weak-kneed participant collapsed before the starting line. Another did so a few steps later. A third quickly ran into a railing. Still, the remaining 18 humanoid robots taking part in a Beijing half-marathon on April 19th leapt, skipped or trundled glitchlessly onto a special track in a technology park on the outskirts of the Chinese capital, and into the future. The winner crossed the finishing line in a stately 2 hours and 40 minutes. 5 more completed the 21.1-kilometre course. Some of the 12,000 human runners, the best of whom covered the distance in just over an hour, looked on bemusedly. A gimmick? Sure, but also an irresistible and clearly intentional metaphor for China's ambition in the technological contest with America. As far as automatons that look and move like human beings go, it is one that now seems China's to lose. Fascination with human-like machines predates robots, a word coined in a 1920 play by Karel Čapek, and which evokes the word for drudgery in his native Czech. Although robotic arms became widespread in manufacturing from the 1960s, it is only now that researchers can recreate human mobility in metal and, thanks to artificial intelligence, or AI, human minds in silicon. As a result, humanoid robots are at last beginning to leave the lab and enter the workplace. On April 22nd, Elon Musk reasserted during an earnings call that he expects thousands of Tesla's Optimus robots to be working in its electric car factories by the end of the year. He predicted that the firm would be churning out 1 million Optimuses by 2030, maybe even 2029. In January, he suggested that they would one day be generating more than $10 trillion in annual sales for Tesla. Like it's really bananas, he gushed. Wall Street is less fruity in its enthusiasm, but only a touch. Goldman Sachs now forecasts that within a decade the market for humanoid robots could be worth $200 billion, up from a bull case in 2023 of $150 billion. Citigroup reckons sales may reach $7 trillion by 2050. Bank of America talks of 3 billion humanoids by 2060, or one for every 3 people, doing everything from handling hazardous materials to caring for the swelling ranks of elderly Homo sapiens. All 3 banks expect China to be at the forefront of the revolution. So does Mr. Musk. He told analysts this week that, of course, he expects Tesla to be number 1. But, he added, I'm a little concerned that ranks 2 through 10 will be Chinese companies. That concern is justified. Mr. Musk knows well what happens when China's leaders go gaga for an emerging industry. In China and elsewhere, Tesla's electric vehicle sales are crashing as Chinese challengers, nurtured on state support then left to compete among themselves, offer EVs that are cheaper, better, or both. Now, the Communist Party is making a similar song and dance about humanoids, both as a matter of technological pride and, given the shrivelling working-age population, out of demographic necessity. In January, robots devised by Unitree, a start-up from Hangzhou, literally pranced on stage during the Spring Festival Gala, a televised state-sponsored celebration of the Chinese New Year. In a speech last month, Li Qiang, China's premier, name-checked Unitree alongside DeepSeek, the national AI superstar. That is encouraging the private sector to pile in. Unitree's corporate backers include Meituan, an e-commerce giant. Agibot, another humanoid startup, has attracted investments by BYD, Tesla's main EV rival, and Tencent, a vast digital conglomerate. Huawei, China's mightiest tech titan, is pursuing its own Android dreams. UB Tech, a rare-listed humanoid maker which went public in 2023 and sells its robots for around $70,000 a pop, expects to ship 500 to 1,000 of them this year and more than 10,000 in 2027. On top of state support, Chinese robot makers enjoy another, bigger advantage over rich world rivals: a well-oiled supply chain. America retains the edge in robot brains, notably in top-notch AI models, OpenAI and Google, and the chips these need to run, NVIDIA, which also provides a software platform to program robots. To keep it that way, this month President Donald Trump again tightened curbs on the export of semiconductors to China. But China is catching up fast in machine thinking. DeepSeek has shown that Chinese algorithms are clever and can do without fancy chips. A day after America's new restrictions came to light, NVIDIA's boss, Jensen Huang, flew to Beijing in a show of commitment to Chinese customers. Meanwhile, Chinese firms dominate the manufacture of components for machine bodies. Of the 60 or so listed makers of robotic eyes, i.e. cameras and sensors, and hands, muscles and joints, actuators, 48 are Chinese. Their combined market value of $217 billion is up by 56% since September, even after the stock market rout provoked by Mr. Trump's tariffs. In the past year, 12 had sales exceeding $1 billion, compared with just 2 of their dozen non-Chinese rivals. That is not counting CATL, the world's leading maker of electric stomachs, batteries. Bank of America says this supply chain will help halve the cost of materials in a Chinese humanoid by 2030 to $17,000. What about America? A $20,000 robot replacing the typical American factory worker would pay for itself in less than 2 months, thinks Citigroup. Sadly for the country's manufacturers, making the gubbins at scale domestically would be costlier, for it means starting from scratch. This would matter less if Mr. Trump were not hacking off allies in Asia and Europe, whose firms already make sundry robotic bits and bobs. The two big non-Chinese part suppliers are German, Schaeffler, and Swedish, SKF. Japanese industrial robot firms like Fanuc make components in-house and could be persuaded to sell them. With their help, America could give Chinese humanoids a run for their money. Alone, it risks being lapped.
Business.
America First Venture Capital. The New Atomic Age. Peter Thiel doubles down on patriotism in the Trump era.
He is obsessed with atoms. Peter Thiel, a prescient venture capitalist, has said that the Manhattan Project, which created the first atomic bomb, epitomized how America's government used to get things done. He has long argued that an excessive focus on bits, or software, at the expense of atoms, or hardware, has helped produce economic stagnation in America. In 2015, he wrote that the country needed a new atomic age to produce clean, abundant energy. A decade on, he has friends at the top of President Donald Trump's administration who share his vision. It is starting to fall into place. In mid-April, Founders Fund, Mr. Thiel's biggest venture capital or VC firm, was the main investor in a funding round that secured $50 million for General Matter, which aims to become the first privately funded startup to enrich uranium in America. In a move rare for Mr. Thiel, who likes to stay in the background, the billionaire will also sit on the company's board. The investment may be just the start, considering the scale of General Matter's ambition. It hopes to develop a technology from scratch to produce uranium enriched to a level up to 4 times greater than anything commercially available today, in order to fuel a new breed of advanced nuclear reactors. It will probably cost billions. The fledgling company is part of a group of unabashedly patriotic startups, backed by MAGA-friendly VCs such as Founders Fund and Andreessen Horowitz that represent a new mindset in Silicon Valley. As Mr. Trump takes aim at China and embraces autarky, these firms are seizing the opportunities that are emerging as a result. General Matter boasts that it will reduce America's dependence on Russia for uranium supplies, provide energy security to compete in the artificial intelligence or AI race with China, and rely exclusively on American technology and finance. Based in Los Angeles, within a mile of the ocean, it is nicknamed the Manhattan Beach Project. General Matter may have a nondescript name, which recalls Ian Fleming's Universal Exports, and a secretive air. Its red brick offices are unmarked. But its pedigree is intriguing. Scott Nolan, its founder, is a partner at Founders Fund and formerly an engineer at SpaceX, Elon Musk's rocket firm. Lee Robinson, a founding member, worked in intelligence. If Mr. Thiel and Mr. Musk had a clandestine corporate love child, General Matter would be it. It plans to take advantage of a Department of Energy or DOE program, which dates back to Mr. Trump's first term, to create high-assay, low-enriched uranium, or HALEU. That is nuclear fuel enriched to between 5% and 20% for the small modular reactors, or SMRs, that some hope will one day power the AI revolution. Low-enriched uranium, or LEU, which is used in today's nuclear power plants, is below 5%. Russia currently provides America with 35% of its nuclear fuel, including almost all its HALEU, under a sanctions waiver that expires in 2028, hence the quest to find alternative sources. General Matter refuses to disclose what enrichment technology it is working on, and in what state the enrichment plant will be located. Mr. Nolan says only that, like SpaceX, it is going back to first principles, and that its engineers range from clever 20-somethings to nuclear industry veterans of retirement age. Founders Fund and the American government treat General Matter like a princeling. Almost a year before it was incorporated in 2024, it had caught the federal government's eye. In early 2023, the DOE named it as part of a 70-strong HALEU consortium. Late last year, it was one of 4 firms to win a spot to compete for a $2.7 billion contract to supply HALEU to the government, as well as one of 6 in the running for an LEU contract worth up to $3.4 billion. That was granted at the tail end of the Biden administration. The firm expects nuclear innovation to have even more support under Mr. Trump. Competitors who for a time knew little about the firm, except for an address at Founders Fund's offices in San Francisco, were dumbfounded at how it could come out of nowhere, promising such complex innovation, and convince the government to take it seriously. They won't be spinning centrifuges in Mr. Thiel's office, that's for sure, joked one. And as for using SpaceX's engineering principles, he quipped, "It's one thing to have a rocket blow up. In the nuclear industry, you don't really do it that way." Yet many have missed out on making money by failing to take Mr. Thiel and his acolytes seriously. One of the early backers of Facebook and SpaceX, Mr. Thiel has made a $16.5 billion fortune by going against the grain. In 2016, he was the first prominent figure in Silicon Valley to support Mr. Trump. Although he did not make an endorsement this time, he helped bankroll the early political career of J.D. Vance, a former colleague, who is now America's vice president. Moreover, Mr. Thiel and Founders Fund have a history of incubating other firms that aim to do highly sensitive work in support of America's national security, using hitherto unproven technology. One is Palantir, a big data firm set up in 2003 to help America fight terrorism, which is now worth $180 billion. The second is Anduril, a maker of autonomous weapons that is disrupting America's military-industrial complex, and was last valued at $14 billion. Former employees of both companies, as well as of Mr. Thiel's investment firms, have joined the Trump administration. Trey Stevens, a partner at Founders Fund, and one of the founders of Anduril, casts General Matter as the third in the trilogy, building energy technology to help America compete in the energy-hungry AI race against China. We are getting absolutely lapped by China in building new nuclear capabilities. He adds that Founders Fund is also looking into onshoring other sensitive supply chains, including the extreme ultraviolet light lithography machines needed to create the most advanced semiconductors. There are big hurdles ahead for General Matter. The first is a chicken and egg problem. Unless there is a HALEU supply chain in place, it is hard to build advanced nuclear reactors that rely on the fuel. Yet until it is clear that the new reactors have a future, making HALEU is a speculative, capital-intensive bet. The DOE's support is aimed at overcoming that dilemma. On April 9th, it said it would provide a first batch of HALEU to some SMRs, but it cannot guarantee the long-term viability of the reactors, nor of a domestic supply chain for producing uranium. A second hurdle is competition. The 3 other companies that have been picked by the DOE to compete to supply HALEU are well established. They include American subsidiaries of two European nuclear fuel providers, Urenco, a consortium made up of the British, Dutch and German governments, and Orano, a mostly state-owned French firm. Rounding out their number is Centrus Energy, a listed American firm that was once part of the government. In 2023, Centrus produced 20 kilograms of HALEU, the first output in America in 70 years. General Matter hopes that its technology will make HALEU in bigger quantities at lower cost. Yet, as its rivals point out, it has not yet formally sought a license from America's Nuclear Regulatory Commission, something that can take years to approve. Margaret O'Mara, a historian of Silicon Valley at the University of Washington, notes the incongruity of libertarians like Mr. Thiel harking back to a golden era of government intervention in the economy at the height of the Cold War. She calls it the space age, brought to you by Ayn Rand. And yet she notes that Silicon Valley got its start building computers for atomic warheads. Then the anti-nuclear peaceniks took over in the 1960s, starting the drift away from national security tech. If Mr. Thiel has his way, it will come full circle. With luck, it will not end with more nuclear bombs.
Business.
Energy. Pipe dream. America won't be able to bully the world into buying more gas.
For countries worried that their trade surpluses with America put them in the firing line for tariffs, Donald Trump has a solution: buy American fuel. This month, Mr. Trump declared that his country's deficit with the European Union would disappear easily and quickly if the bloc did only that. He and his cabinet have pressed other allies, including India and the Philippines, to increase their purchases of American liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Scott Bessent, Mr. Trump's Treasury Secretary, has sought to persuade Japan, South Korea and Taiwan to invest in a vast LNG project in Alaska and commit themselves to purchasing a substantial portion of the site's output. At first blush, the plan seems plausible. America is the world's largest producer and exporter of LNG after a decade of rapid expansion. Mr. Trump has sought to encourage further growth in the industry through various deregulatory measures, including the axing of a Biden-era fee on emissions of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, from oil and gas sites. Yet the president's own economic and foreign policies are likely to get in the way of his energy ambitions. American gas companies certainly spy an opportunity in the trade war. Expanding LNG exports is one of the most effective ways for America to narrow its deficits, argues Mike Sable, chief executive of Venture Global, an American LNG firm. After a disappointing initial public offering in January, his company's fortunes look to be improving. On April 15th, a subsidiary raised $2.5 billion in the first high-yield bond issuance in America since the mayhem caused by Mr. Trump's tariff pronouncements on April 2nd. America's allies are sending encouraging signals too. A plan from the European Commission to phase out Russian gas is due to be published in early May. Some European leaders support replacing it with imports from America. India is considering ending duties on American LNG. Ishiba Shigeru, Japan's Prime Minister, has intimated that his country may be willing to invest in the Alaskan mega-project. Yet lifting LNG exports will not be so easy. For a start, the country lacks sufficient infrastructure to quickly ramp up shipments. We have the gas, we just don't have the pipelines to get it places, explains Toby Rice, chief executive of EQT, another big American gas company. export terminals are already running close to their maximum capacity. To make matters worse, Mr. Trump's tariffs will hobble American firms' ability to supply LNG and other countries' demand for it. At home, the trade war has sent the cost of steel and other inputs for new American LNG projects soaring. We don't see a massive wave of gas coming on, says Kaushal Ramesh of Rystad Energy, a consultancy. Much of the expansion in LNG capacity that is confirmed is already promised to overseas buyers on long-term contracts. Although there are a number of other proposed LNG projects in America, developers require long-term commitments from buyers to persuade their financiers to hand over funding. Securing those commitments will be tricky. Demand is expected to slow as many economies are struck by Mr. Trump's trade war. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, an official forecaster, predicts that growth in demand for gas in Asia will slump to 2% this year, down from 5.5% in 2024. And American LNG is now unwelcome in China, which last month halted all imports of the fuel from its trade war adversary. Chinese energy firms have recently announced big LNG deals with ADNOC, an Emirati hydrocarbon giant. Such buyers had been expected to significantly increase gas purchases from America in the next few years. The outlook seems somewhat rosier in Europe, which has grappled with the shortfall in gas since Russia cut back exports after the invasion of Ukraine. The continent's LNG imports will rise by a quarter this year, according to the IEA. Yet European buyers have been reluctant to commit themselves to signing long-term contracts for American LNG. Some worry that climate regulations could one day ban the use of gas. Others expect a glut in global gas supply to emerge over the next few years, which would cause prices to collapse. Then there is the possibility that large amounts of Russian gas will resume flowing into Europe after a peace deal with Ukraine is signed, another of Mr. Trump's ambitions. That would leave little room for buying more LNG from America. Officials in Brussels are adamant they will not allow this, but some German industrialists are already pleading for a return to cheap Russian gas. In any case, even if Europe did dramatically increase its imports of American LNG, it would not do much to resolve the trade imbalance with America. Wood Mackenzie, a consultancy, calculates that if the European Union sourced all of its LNG, diesel and light crude from America, it would reduce its trade surplus in goods by only about a half. The cold reality is that Mr. Trump's dreams for American gas are little more than hot air.
Business.
Tesla. Crash course. Even Republicans are souring on Elon Musk's cars.
The future of Tesla is brighter than ever, so declared Elon Musk during an earnings call on April 22nd. According to the carmaker's boss, Tesla remains on course to become the world's most valuable firm, worth as much as the next 5 companies combined, as it churns out fleets of autonomous taxis and legions of humanoid robots. As Mr. Musk gazes into the future, investors remain transfixed by the car crash that is currently occurring at Tesla. Revenue from its electric vehicles, or EVs, in the first quarter was down by a fifth year-on-year. Operating profit fell by 2/3. Far from racing ahead, Tesla's market value has fallen by roughly half, since peaking at around $1.5 trillion in December. Earlier this month, the company reported that it delivered just 337,000 vehicles in the quarter, 13% fewer than a year before, and well below analysts' expectations. In Europe, which makes up around a fifth of sales, registrations of new Teslas slid by 40%. In America, the carmaker's biggest market, sales fell by almost 9%, even as those of all EVs rose by 11%. Can Tesla recover? Slumping sales partly reflect a backlash against the politics of Mr. Musk, who has lately refashioned himself into a right-wing activist and nemesis of America's deep state. Tesla's showrooms have faced protests and arson attacks since Mr. Musk took his chainsaw to the federal government as head of Donald Trump's Department of Government Efficiency. Some analysts had hoped that, at least in America, a boom in Tesla sales to right-wing consumers would balance out declining sales to left-wing ones. TD Cowen, an investment bank, recently estimated that although Mr. Musk's political activities could cut sales by more than 100,000 vehicles a year in America's Democrat-leaning counties, they could boost them by twice that in Republican-leaning ones. That type of partisan rebalancing was on display last year as Mr. Musk completed his MAGA conversion. Our analysis, drawing on figures from S&P Global, a data provider, suggests that Tesla's sales shrank in left-leaning cities in 2024, while growing in right-leaning ones. For example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, which favoured Kamala Harris in the presidential election by nearly 3-1, sales fell by more than 16% last year. In Tampa, which favoured Mr. Trump by a wide margin, they rose by around 18%. Unfortunately for Mr. Musk, though, even Republicans now appear to be spurning his EVs. Trends in the used car market suggest that a growing number of Tesla owners in both blue and red states are putting them up for sale. Figures from Market Check, which tracks the inventories of more than 75,000 dealerships across America, show that listings of used Teslas have risen by 2/3 since the start of the year, twice as much as for other EVs. Listings for the Model 3 have increased by 63%. Those for the Model Y have rocketed by 80%. The pattern can be seen in both left-leaning states, such as Massachusetts and New York, and right-leaning ones, such as Indiana and South Carolina. That hints at a deeper problem for Tesla: stiffening competition. By contrast with its early years, when it was essentially unchallenged, the carmaker now faces serious threats from rivals, such as General Motors in America and BYD in China and elsewhere. It cannot afford a distracted boss. To investors' relief, Mr. Musk announced during the earnings call that he would now be spending far more of his time away from Washington and at the company. They will be hoping he can speedily reverse Tesla out of its mess.